Quello di cui vorrei parlarvi
What
stasera
I shall
è
be
lo
talking
sguardo
about
e la
this
capacità
evening
straordinaria
is
che abbiamo
the
di
gaze. That
leggere
is to
nello
say, the
sguardo,
outstanding ability
leggere nello
that
sguardo degli
we
altri
have
stati mentali.
in reading the mindset and
Sono
feelings of
laureata in
others in their
filosofia,
gaze.
Piotr scrive
I
Platone,
graduated
sono
in
la via naturale per
philosophy,
arrivare
and
all'uomo.
Plato
Ma
says
questo
that
profilo
eyes are
attiene
the natural
all'anima,
route to the
termine
soul.
mente che non è meno
Basically, if
problematico del
instead
termine
of
anima,
saying
potremmo
the
dire
soul, you say the
l'occhio è la
mind,
via naturale per
which is
arrivare
not
alla mente.
less
In
problematic,
effetti,
we can say that
dallo
eyes
sguardo
are
di
the
un'altra
natural route
persona
to
siamo
the
in
mind.
grado
And
di
in
intuire
fact,
a che cosa è interessata,
we
a cosa sta
can
prestando attenzione, ma
understand
anche
what
cosa
the
desidera
person
e quindi
is
cosa
thinking
immagina.
of, but what they wish and what they intend to do.
Osservando una scena complessa come questa, per esempio, il nostro sguardo
Observing a
tende a
complex
focalizzarsi su
scene
quella che è la regione
like
degli
this
occhi.
one, our
Perché?
gaze
La
dwells
scena dipinta
upon
da
the
Georges
eyes.
Latour
Why?
rappresenta un
Well,
giovane
the scene
tentato di
that
farsi
was
predire
painted by Georges Latour represents a
dalla
youngster with
donna
a fortune
indovina
teller.
che è la donna anziana
And
sulla
she's a
destra,
fortune teller. You
ma che
can see
cosa
her, the older
avviene
woman, on the
mentre
right.
è proprio
But in fact, what
l'incrociarsi
is
degli
happening in
sguardi,
the
il gioco degli
meantime?
sguardi a
It
rivelarcelo.
is, if you look at
Partiamo
it,
dalla
the way
ragazza
in which the
pallida alla
gazes
destra del
cross
giovane.
each other,
La ragazza
that you
pallida
understand
alla
what is
destra del
happening. Let us
giovane
see the
sta
pale girl to the
monitorando
right
attentamente,
of
guarda il
the
giovane
youngster.
e
She is
sicura che il
carefully
giovane non si
looking
accorga di
at
nulla,
him,
il giovane sta
watching
guardando
him,
l'indovina
to be sure that
si accinge a
he will
tagliare uno
not
dei medaglioni che
realize what is
indossa.
happening while he looks
Non è finita
at
qui.
the
Alla
fortune teller.
sinistra
She
della
is
scena
cutting one of
vedete
the
una donna con
medallions
il,
he's
una
wearing.
donna giovane
But
con
to
il
his
corsetto.
left, there's
Ha
more.
lo sguardo
In
verso
fact,
il
there is a
basso, rivolto
young
verso il
woman
basso.
wearing a bonnet.
Seguiamo lo sguardo
She's
della
looking
donna e
downwards.
vediamo che la donna è intenta a
Follow her
rubare dalla
gaze,
tasca del
and you
giovane
see
una
that
collana.
she is
La
picking
donna
his
accanto a
pocket
lei
and
guarda il
stealing a
giovane, si
necklace.
assicura che il giovane
The
non noti
woman
nulla,
next to
gli mostra
her
la mano e
is
pronta a ricevere
looking at the
la collana
youngster,
da complice
and
e aspirato.
she is
Per
stretching her
ricostruire
hand
questo
out
complesso
so that she
intreccio non
can
abbiamo bisogno di
receive
conoscere nulla
the
né dello
necklace that
sguardo
her
né
accomplice
dell'autore.
has
È
just stolen.
sufficiente
We don't need to know
osservare
anything about the
che
author or the picture
l'interazione
to
tra
understand
gli
this.
sguardi,
It is enough to
l'interazione
observe
degli
the
sguardi ha
interaction that
svelato
exists
questa
amongst the
trama così
gazes. It
complessa.
is such interaction that reveals
Un
the
aspetto
complex
interessante è che
plot.
rispetto all'orientamento del
An
tronco e
interesting
della
feature is
testa,
that
lo
compared
sguardo
to
fornisce
the
una
position
indicazione
of the
molto più
trunk and the
precisa
head,
di
our
dove stiamo
gaze
allocando la
supplies
nostra
a more
attenzione,
accurate
a cosa prestiamo
idea
attenzione.
of what is
L'informazione
drawing our
possibile derivare
attention.
dallo
What are
sguardo
we
è molto
looking
più
at?
precisa di
The
quella che possiamo
information that
derivare
we can
dall'orientamento degli
derive
occhi e della
is
testa.
more
Guardando
accurate than
queste
the one
immagini, per
which
esempio,
we
potremmo
can
essere
appreciate
portati
just
a
looking at the
pensare che
position
l'uomo
of
e la
the
donna
person.
stiano
If
guardando
looking
la
at this
stessa cosa.
image, you might think
Ma è
that the
davvero
man and
così?
woman are looking at the same thing. But is that
La
so?
direzione dello sguardo ci dice che non è così. In
In fact,
effetti,
the
l'uomo e
direction of
la
the
donna
gaze
non
tells us
guardano
something
la stessa
different.
cosa.
And in fact, the man and the woman are looking at two different things.
Osservando lo sguardo di un'altra persona, oltre a capire a che cosa sta prestando
Observing the gaze of
attenzione,
someone else,
siamo anche
as
in
well
grado di
as understanding
intuire
what they're looking
qual
at,
è la sua
we are
intenzione, che
also
cosa
able to
intende
infer or
fare.
understand what their intentions are,
La scena
what
che
they
vi
intend to
mostro, a
do.
dimostrazione di quanto ho appena detto,
The
è tratta
scene
da
that you will
un
be
celebre
seeing
film
will
di
prove what I've
Sergio
said.
Leone, per
It's
qualche modo anche
drawn
più.
from
Quello
a
che vedete
movie
è
by
un
Sergio
piccolo giro
Leone,
di
a very
sguardi.
famous spaghetti western, and
Il
it
colonnello
is the
Mortimer
gazes
e
that will tell us
Becchio,
what is
interpretato
happening.
da Gianmaria Volonté,
Colonel
si
Mortimer
fronteggiano in
and
un duello di sguardi.
the
Osservate, quello che vi chiedo di osservare con attenzione è lo sguardo del
Indios
colonnello.
are challenging each other. Please focus on the gaze of the colonel.
Il filmato termina qui. Per sapere che il colonnello
To know
afferrare il fucile,
if and when the colonel is going to pick up the rifle, we don't need the colonel to bend down. We don't have to wait for the beginning of the movement. We can read that in his gaze. We are able, reading into his gaze, to understand what he intends to do. In fact, there are situations in which intention and gaze seem to be the same when the gaze is action. This is what we showed in this study, and we used functional magnetic resonance. It's a technique that makes it possible to look inside the brain to see which brain areas become active when there is a stimulus, like a video, for example. What we did is that we used functional magnetic resonance to understand which areas of the brain will become active as a reaction to an action, for example, grasp an object, or which areas become active if you simply observe it, to act and to look or watch. During the observation, for example, if you're looking at a person doing something, in your and in my brain, you will see that a number of areas will become active, and that's the so-called action observation network. The action observation network includes some of the areas that have mirror qualities, that is to say, areas that would not only become active when you look at someone else, but when personally you are involved in this. They're called mirror in English. Yes, we had a conference by Rizzolatti on this. Probably he spoke about the mirror neurons. Yes, they were discovered in monkeys using a technique which we can't use with human beings, but thanks to functional magnetic resonance, we are able to prove how the same areas that become active in the course of an action are also active in the course of observation. So action and observation. Now, the interesting feature of this is the following. The same circuit, including the mirror areas that I was talking about, becomes active not only when you observe an action, but also when you observe the person's gaze, or you gaze at the object. Now, why? The hypothesis we're working on is that we are able to anticipate, to understand before it happens what the person is going to do. We are able to read this person's intention. We're able to know what actions will be carried for. Plato says that the gaze is a natural or preferential route to the brain. We can say that it is also able to tell us what intentions are. A rather curious aspect, which has to do with the so-called mirror areas, is the so-called contagion. That is to say, other gazes are contagious. The actions of other people are contagious in a sort of automatic and involuntary manner. This is how we tend to reproduce actions. This is what is called motocontagion. That is to say, we are affected by other people's gaze. Such phenomena may also take place by looking. We can experience this contagion on the basis of the intention that we see in the other person's eye. Before the person acts, the intention can become contagious.
Dalla capacità di leggere gli stati mentali nello sguardo altrui,
the ability to read the mind was not only to do with the way in which we represent other people's minds, but it also has to do with the objects other people interact with. The power of the gaze, and how it modifies objects under observation. When other people look, the objects they're looking at seem to acquire properties they did not have before. Now, the first one is a rather unusual phenomenon. This evening, although it concerns a range of different spheres, I will be concentrating on the latter. The first impact that another person's gaze has is that we shift our focus onto the object that the person is looking at. Let me just show you a brief sequence. Here you can see that the person's gaze, the person's face, has shifted our attention, and there's an object there now that has appeared. But even before the object appears, our gaze has moved to the place where the object would have appeared. Why? Because we followed the movement of the gaze. Let me show you the sequence again. Here you can see that the person is moving their eyes, and then the object appears. This automatic shift of focus, automatic shift of gaze, and therefore of focus, is a quasi-automatic system. We can't but shift our gaze too and follow the direction indicated by the other person. We tend to shift our gaze and move towards the other area. We also do this when we know that the fact that the person has shifted their focus does not mean that the object will appear there. But in spite of the fact that we're not certain that the object will appear, we will still be following the shift of the gaze. We're not able to resist the power of the attention shift. This is something that can be measured. If, for instance, I had asked you to tell me when an object had appeared to the right or to the left of the face, what I can measure is the time that elapses before you react. And you'll see that there is a smaller time lag when the person's gaze has shifted before. It makes us faster. Why? Because the shift of the person's gaze has led us automatically to shift our focus too. Now, this automatic shift of attention is not the only effect that it has. Not only do we focus on what other people are looking at, but objects that other people are looking at are objects that we like more. It's the liking effect. If you're looking at it, I like it even more. I like it more than what I would if you weren't looking at it. In terms of the shift of attention, a face or an arrow have a very similar effect. If we have an arrow pointing to an object, we tend to follow that arrow. But unlike the face, the arrow has no impact on the emotional impact. We don't like an object that is indicated or that an arrow is pointing to, while if a person's gaze dwells upon it, we do like it more. Now, why is there I like this effect? The impact of this effect, the so-called liking effect, has recently found an explanation. The one we suggested is that this is a shift of intentional, is in fact the result of us transferring our attention. According to this interpretation, what happens is that The mental state read into the other person's gaze is then transferred on the object, and this interpretation is confirmed in a study that proved how the impact on the object varies according to the mental state which we read into the other person's gaze. The face above, as you can see, expresses disgust, while the one below looks at the object and is happy. The impact on the object is quite the opposite. That is to say, that if a person is expressing disgust, disgusted while looking at an object, you too will react likewise. While if the face is happy, then you probably like the object much more. This is interesting because it tells us that the liking effect is the result of the association between the gaze and the object, but it is in particular the mental approach that you're reading into the other person's gaze that is transferred onto the object. It's an experiment that we carried out very recently, led us to discover this other effect. For this to happen, for the liking effect to take place, it's not enough for the person just to look at it, but the face must be able to see the object. And we showed this by placing a barrier between the face and the object. So our face turns towards the object, but the barrier makes it impossible for the person to see the object. In this case, there is no liking effect. This tells us that for the transfer of intention to take place, it is necessary for the face to be able to see the object. It's an impact which, as you can well imagine, was not just discovered in inverted commas by a psychologist and a neuroscientist. It is used in advertising and commercials because, and in advertising very often people are looking at the object. It doesn't depend on the type of object in this experiment. In fact, we created an experiment so as to exclude the fact that a particular object may be more pleasing. It's something to do with the person's gaze. This ability, this extremely sophisticated skill that we have in monitoring other people's gaze, this ability, which is extremely complex, leads us to be able to identify a 3-degree shift in the eye. Well, this particular skill is favored by the nature of the human eye. And this is very clear if you compare the features of a human eye with the eyes of other primates. In this image here, you can see a gorilla, a chimpanzee, and a human being. In these 3 species, eyes are very different. One of the first differences concerns the size of the eyes. In human beings, the eye area is disproportionately big compared to the other primates. For example, compared to an orangutan, human beings have 3 times as big a space for their eyes. But that's not the only difference. A study that was carried out by a Japanese researcher on the 82 types of primates showed how morphologically the humans have a very different eye. If we compare the 92 species of primates, human beings are the only ones to have type 4. What is type 4? Type 4 has 2 very interesting features: a very high degree of contrast of the eye outline and the sclera. Now, this is the face and sclera and iris relationship, There's also a very strong contrast between the iris and the sclera, which the white of the eye. It means that the person's eyes are very visible, more visible than the gorillas or chimpanzees are. But this is not the only feature. As well as having this very strong contrast, a type 4 eye also has a very strong contrast between the iris and the sclera. Now, why is this important? What does this mean? It means that you can more easily monitor the position or the shift in position of the eye. This is much more difficult to appreciate the shift of focus in a type 1 or type 2 eye, where the contrast between sclera and iris is very low. Only human beings have a type 4 eye, which has the combination of eyes being a visible part of the face and the fact that you can clearly monitor the gaze, which is to do with the iris sclera. Differences. Now, these differences lead to very interesting aspects. It's something that is not easily seen in everyday life. We found it in the lab. Non-human primates mainly refer to the movement of the head. They follow the movement of the head, while human beings rely more, prevalently at least, on the shift of gaze. I was saying in our everyday life, it's very difficult to observe it because usually when you shift your gaze, you're also moving your head. But this type of movement becomes clear in a situation with there are inconsistencies, such as the ones which you can see to the left of the image. As you can see, the head is going up, but the gaze is looking down, or the head is going down, but the gaze is going up. What happens in these cases? In these cases, non-human primates, because the study was carried out on chimps and gorillas and orangutans, tend to follow the movement of the head. In the first case, they look up. In the second case, they look down. Human beings will follow the gaze, and they do that already at 12 months. That is to say, very small babies rely prevalently on the direction of the gaze rather than on where the head is. If the researcher, before lifting his or her head, closes his or her eyes, the orangutan, the gorilla, and the chimps will in any case follow the movement of the head. Children, when they're about 12 months, as I was saying, will be not following the movement of the head, but the movement of the gaze, or the gaze itself. Why have we evolved visible eyes? Why did we evolve type 4? And why did other non-humans or non-human primates did not? The hypothesis is compatible with what I've said. And that is to say that we have developed this to cooperate and communicate. Having very good type 4 eyes, good in the sense that they're able to monitor the gaze, makes it easier for people to follow the intention of the gaze. This has an advantage, and it's an objective advantage in a situation of competition and cooperation. No, of cooperation, but not of competition. This comes from the observation that humans tend to cooperate from a very early age, even before other primates, long before. We do this even when there is no specific individual advantage in it. We cooperate for the pleasure of cooperating, even when we do not receive a particular advantage for this. This clip, which I'll be showing you, was carried out in Leipzig at the Max Planck Institute. As you can see, the researcher is not very good and he's clumsy and he can't open the cupboard. He's trying. No, not working. Can't open the cupboard. What's going to happen? Look, there you are, the baby's going on, the toddler's moving and opening the cupboard. Put it in. Now, in this version, the clip finishes here, but you'll see online what happens afterwards. In fact, at this point, the researcher goes out and comes back, and the child, as soon as he sees the researcher coming in, holding all the papers, runs to the cupboard and opens the cupboard. Behavior such as this are not easily observed in non-human primates. Chimpanzees or gorillas, but in particular chimpanzees, are able to coordinate their actions with those of other members. For example, they can do it if they're hunting. It has been proved, these were studies that were carried out in the field, not in a lab, that if there's group hunting, the chimpanzees are able to coordinate their actions with other members' actions, so that they're, for example, able to catch a monkey that's running away. But the big difference with human beings is the following. We cooperate for the joy of cooperating, while normal primates, including chimpanzees, cooperate only in situations where it gives an individual advantage. If cooperation does not give an individual advantage, the chimpanzee won't cooperate, nor will it cooperate even if there is a collective reward. And the reason is that it's only the dominant chimp that will receive the reward. They don't share rewards. Now let's go back to the cooperative eye hypothesis. That is to say that we developed visible eyes, such as ours, to favor the monitoring of the gaze of other members of our species. The fact that others are able to read the direction of my gaze has pros and cons. For example, in a situation of competition, it might be an objective disadvantage. In fact, it can give my competitor an advantage if he or she are able to identify what my gaze dwells upon. In a situation of competition, a situation of visible eyes can be a disadvantage. And this, again, might explain why in species where competition prevails, you don't have type 4 eyes, while visible eyes, which favor the monitoring by other members of the species, is an advantage where cooperation is essential. The other one is able to read my intention in my eyes before I even act. And this makes coordinating and cooperation much easier. To coordinate and to cooperate with others means that you have to anticipate what the other person is doing. If we had to wait for the other person to act ourselves, we would not be even able to shift a table together. If our ability to cooperate lies in the fact that we're able to guess what the person is going to do. So according to the cooperative I hypothesis, we developed eyes type 4 or type 4 eyes precisely because we have to be able to read the intentions of the other members of our species. Another hypothesis, which does not exclude what I'm saying, the alternative hypothesis, is the one whereby we have developed type 4 eyes not only or not simply because we have to monitor the gaze of the other members of the species, but because others tend to behave better if they are under my gaze. According to this hypothesis, the gaze is able to modify what it is looking at. It's not only to do with objects, as we mentioned earlier on, but it has to do with behavior. The power of the gaze, how our behavior changes when we act under the gaze of others. It's not something strange. It's something which has to do a lot with what we call a reputation. In everyday language, we are concerned with what other people can think of our behavior. When we know that we're observed by others, we tend to behave better, to be more honest and more generous. The surprising aspect, what is really surprising, is that we tend to be more generous and altruistic when we are even under the image's gaze. Look at an image like this one, very schematic. Researchers prove this using the dictator's game. Do you know it? Do you know what it does? It's the game called a dictator. Well, it's not a democratic game, is it? Because otherwise it wouldn't be called a dictator's game. There are two players, player A and player B. Player A is the dictator, and the player A receives $10, say. And then the question is, how much will you transfer to player B? Player B, in this game, is totally passive and can only accept the donation by A. They can't negotiate and they can't refuse. That's why it's called the game of the dictator. What do we see? Well, the first thing to be considered is the following. If it is true that with this type of game, 30% of participants do not transfer any money to player B, it is also true that the remaining 70% transfers part of the money that they have received to player B. And if you think of it, this is quite interesting because it's irrational. Well, let us say. It's irrational according to the definition of rationality that classical economic theory suggests. Rational would be, well, it is defined as a behavior which maximizes utility, individual, in fact, utility or advantage. So to be rational, we should not transfer any money to player B. But in 70% of all cases, this is not so, and people decide to transfer part of the money they've received to B. What researchers wondered is whether the participants, the players, would have been even more generous if the game had been offered with a gaze at the back, either playing it on the computer. And this is the type of screen that participants had in the course of the experiment. You receive €10, $10, whatever. How much would you like to transfer to player B? Now, in the control, the same question was asked with a background that did not have eyes, but just had a geometrical pattern. Do you expect the reaction to be different? I expect so. Well, yes, of course, otherwise I wouldn't be talking about it. Here you see the difference. This slide shows the percentage of donors given the two different backgrounds. You see that with the pattern, the geometrical pattern, we have roughly 50% of all participants who are prepared to donate part of the money that they've received to player B. This percentage increases when you have the gaze, and it nearly reaches 80%. This means that we have a significant increase in the percentage of donors. It's very schematic representation. What happens with the real gaze or with the supplicant gaze? This is not the only effect. Not only does the number or the percentage of donors increase, but the average donation increases. It goes from $2.45 to $3.75. The sum doesn't double, but we're close to it. So under a gaze, when you're playing the game of the dictator, under somebody else's gaze, although the gaze is only represented here very schematically, we tend to be more generous towards the other player. This is something which Professor Bianucci was suggesting. Does this happen? Does it really happen in everyday life? I don't know if some of you are envisaging a practical application. You might want to hear what follows. This is what the Newcastle researchers asked themselves, Newcastle in the UK. That is to say, is it possible to reproduce the dictator effect in our everyday life? To answer this question, they used an honesty box. An honesty box is just a box, isn't it? And it's an object which is not very widespread in Italy, and maybe we should ask ourselves why. I think I know the answer about that. Well, the honesty box works like this. It's a container box where you put a certain amount of money which corresponds to a service or a product. Say, for example, the sale of newspapers in Switzerland or France. There's no one who checks whether you have actually paid your money, your 50 cents in the box. The way in which an honesty box works is that it's based on the sense of honesty that people have. In this particular instance, the honesty box was within the university, within the Department of Psychology. So, in fact, the professors and students were our subjects, closer to the coffee machine. Well, it was actually tea and coffee. They had a sign like this: tea 30 pence, coffee 50p, milk 10p. And this was what people were asked to pay into the honesty box, to understand whether people would behave differently in a more generous manner with this gaze. So what they did was the photo of two eyes was put just on top of the honesty box every week. Then it was replaced with flowers. So 1 week eyes, 1 week flowers, 1 week eyes and 1 week flowers, and so on for a number of weeks. And this is the result. What you can see here, it's a sort of zigzag, jagged graph, and it has to do with the amounts deposited. As you can see, when there was a picture of two eyes, people paid more, but the following week, when there were flowers, people paid less. And it increased again when flowers were replaced by eyes. It works. You can think of using this system in everyday life. In fact, it works when we act under other people's gaze, even when eyes are represented in a very schematic manner, or when it's a photo. We tend to be more generous and more honest. All I've said so far is true for a typical observer, but this is not true if the person is autistic. Autism is a pathology of development which affects social skills. As far as gazes are concerned, people suffering from autism, even children suffering from it, know that eyes are to see, and they're also able to indicate correctly the direction of the other person's gaze. So it's not a problem of the perception of the direction of the gaze. But what they do find difficult is to read the mind in other people's eyes. This is a test which autistic children are given and which highlights the difficulties. This is Larry, they told this face. What is Larry looking at? Autistic children have no difficulty. The question which they can't answer is, what does Larry want? For us, the two things are the same. We're able to say what Larry's looking at, and automatically we would say that that is what Larry prefers. Autistic children correctly indicate what Larry's looking at, but it's as if they were blind to the meaning, to the mental meaning of a gaze. This is why we talk about mind blindness. That is to say that you can't see the mind. And this type of blindness becomes particularly obvious when you have to read the other people's mental state in their gaze. The processing of gazes in autistic people, it can be observed, the eye tracing of both typical or autistic people. The yellow lines in this image represent the movements of the eye, while the red dots are when the gaze is fixed. The bigger the circle, the longer the gaze is dwelling on something. Above, you can see a typical observation. In fact, the gaze of the typical observer focuses on the eye, but what you see down below is the tracing of an autistic observer. There is a very big difference. Autistic observers don't focus on eyes. Why? Several hypotheses have been made. There is no definitive answers, but one of the hypotheses is that this depends on mind blindness. This difference between normal and autistic observers becomes even more obvious when you move to a more complex scene. In this study of stimuli, you see there are a number of sequences that are drawn from a very well-known movie, which is Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. The movie is a story of a middle-aged couple, Martha and George. They've invited to dinner a colleague of George's, a young colleague of George's, that is to say, Nick and his wife. The four of them are chatting, but because of the sort of late hour and alcohol, they start a truth game. Martha and George exchange accusation. George tells Martha that she's a spoilt child, and Martha answers telling George that he's professionally a failure, and that her father tried to promote him but failed too. And this is the scene where Martha says that George was not able to live up to her father's expectations. What she's talking about is when she fell in love with George. She says there were some practical reasons too. Martha's father, in fact, was hoping George would take over as a director of the Department of History, and maybe he would become the dean or the chancellor. And George challenges Martha, saying that he too has a few secrets to unearth. The young colleague intervenes to try and calm the waters, but there's nothing to do, and Martha just goes on and on and on. Her father had great expectations and thought that this, that is to say, George, would have been an optimal solution. George could have replaced him. That is what she thought, and this is what she thought too, until she got to know George better. And then she realized that George lacked the energy and the aggressiveness to replace him, the stuff. George didn't have the stuff to do. He didn't have any push. A big fat flop. George reacts, and the final lines is that she says that she hopes that the bottle was empty because on his salary he couldn't afford to break a full bottle. This is one of the sequences that we used in the study. The participants were observers, autistic observers, adult autistic people. What or how do we react? Where do we focus on? What do we focus on in a scene such as this? What researchers observed is that they recreated frame by frame the tracing of the neurotypical as opposed to the autistic observers. In yellow, you will see the tracing of a typical observer, while in red you have the tracing of an autistic observer. There's a clear difference. This difference becomes even more obvious in this image. Martha and Nick are talking, but the object of their conversation is in the background. It's George. So the typical observer will have a triangular observation, Martha, Nick, and George. But if you look down below at the autistic person's tracing, you see this very different. There's no triangulation. The people who suffer from autism look or focus on specific parts of the scene and really considers some objects in the scene important, objects which normal people would not consider important. They tend not to focus or dwell on eyes. In a dialogue, for instance, their gaze does not dwell on other people's gazes or how they interact. It focuses on the mouth. Why? Researchers wondered. Again, a possible answer is that this depends on the mind blindness that they have. If I'm mind blind to your gaze, well then I will focus on the mouth, which is the part of the face which produces sound, precisely because I'm unable to interpret the gaze. Researchers, and we're moving towards the conclusion, developed a test which helps us understand what we read into the eyes. Simon Baron-Cohen developed it. There are a series of photos, 36 photos, and there are 4 adjectives. And you're asked to choose which one best describes the gaze, what you feel that gaze has. We can try, for example. It's reading the mind in eyes test. Shame, concerned, surprised, and serious.
Serio? Adesso interroghiamo anche il professor Bianucci.
Ma sono molto incerto in realtà. Mi stavo domandando
Concerned,
perché sono così.
serious.
Sono due occhi molto diversi. Intanto
Let's ask Professor
mi
Bianucci.
verrebbe da dare una soluzione per l'uno, una
I'm
soluzione per l'altro,
uncertain,
che
in
credo
fact,
sia
and I was
questo.
wondering why. They're very different eyes. The two eyes are not the same, so I would interpret one eye in one way and not the other one. Yes, it's my mistake. I shouldn't have asked a philosopher. The test works if you don't think about it. You shouldn't think about it. You sort of guess. So let's not ask philosophers. Let's look at this one. Reflexive, horrified, irritated, or impatient.
E quindi lei oscilla tra?
Beh, sarei piuttosto
Again, contrasting messages. The two eyes are different.
La risposta corretta.
So
Nella immagine
però sono
precedente
turbato da
era
here I would
seria,
say
la risposta
reflexive,
la
but
vergogna
that's the correct answer.
invece in quella precedente.
In the previous one, it
Però ero
was
turbato
serious.
dall'altro occhio.
dall'altro occhio.
I was also interested in shame for the previous one, but I was bothered by one of the two eyes. Last one.
Insistente.
Joking,
Dal pubblico è
insistent,
venuta la risposta
amused, and relaxed.
corretta. Potete
Amused, insistent. The public gave us the right answer in this case. The audience did. On the sheet of paper that you've received, there is a website which has all the 36 pictures. So what happens if you're not a philosopher, so we exclude philosophers, is that very often we give the right answer without knowing why. It's as if you were trying to answer and by chance you picked the correct one. This is a test which people who are autistic have enormous difficulty in carrying out. In this test, people who are autistic have a much lower score than others. Of course, there are variations. There's a range. Individuals have different scores, and they may be to do with the fact that we may have autistic traits that can be found in a typical population to a greater or lesser degree. I will conclude my presentation inviting you to read and telling your story. The book I would like to advise is Chris Firth, Making Up the Mind, How Brains Create Our Mental Life. Chris Firth is a cognitive neuroscientist. He has studied a number of different problems linked to the interaction between mind, body, and world. This book is very beautiful, and it's not superficial, but it's a popularization, and it's a sort of introduction to the complex relationship between mind, brain, and other minds. And the story which I'm going to tell you is drawn from this book, and it refers to the author himself. In fact, Frith imagines that he's at a party, and a young, rather presumptuous man, not wearing a tie, goes near to him, probably a molecular genetic researcher. And this young person asks him, "Are you a psychologist? Can you read my mind?" But Frith says he must be an intelligent person, but why is he asking me such a stupid question? I'm sure he's doing it as a provocation. And only recently, Frith says, I realized I was the stupid one. Of course I can read other people's mind, not because I'm a psychologist. It's simply because we all do it all the time, also and especially through our gaze. I would like to thank you very much.